In the previous unit, 10.1, we discussed the fundamental concepts of thinking. In this unit, 10.2, we will add to those concepts in our discussion of decision-making and forming judgments. If you remember from the previous unit, we discussed the difference between heuristics and algorithms, where heuristics are a mental shortcut that is prone to errors, but is sometimes reliable and a more efficient and faster way of thinking. So with that in mind, who would you trust to babysit your child? This fine-looking man? Or this nice old lady? Well, most of you would say the old lady. Why? Because she fits a prototype of what a nice old babysitter type lady would look like. She looks nurturing and caring, and she looks like she would be good for your kids. Whereas the guy up top, well, would probably be irresponsible and not pay much attention to your kid, and they'd probably get hurt, right? Well, what if it turns out that because you didn't do your research, this lady right here is a criminal. She's a convicted felon for grand theft. And if you allow her to babysit your kids, she's going to steal all the jewelry in your house, and you're going to be robbed blind. And it turns out this guy right here, guess what? He's a medical professional. He's trained in CPR, and he's actually has 4 kids of his own, and he's great with kids. So heuristics can be prone to error, but that doesn't mean they always are. It's just a more efficient way of thinking. So the first type of heuristics that we'll discuss is called availability heuristics. And this is estimating the likelihood of events based on their availability in your memory. So if something is more readily available in your memory, you're going to rely on it to be more generally applicable or to be more generally true. For example, if you watch the news quite often, you'll notice that there's a lot of violent things on the news. There's robbery, there's theft. There's a lot of things that I accuse that old granny of doing. And as such, people tend to think that the world is a bit more violent than it actually is. In fact, crime has been on the decline for the past 3 decades, but most people don't recognize that because of what's in the news. If you want to see another example, read the following. Another type of heuristics is representativeness heuristics. Not representative heuristic, representativeness heuristic. All right, get it right. Okay. So representativeness heuristic is a rule of thumb for judging the likelihood of things in terms of how well they match a prototype. And it can cause us to ignore important information. For example, below is Linda. She loves books and she hates loud noises. Is Linda a librarian or a beautician? Chances are she's a beautician, but by the looks of her and by the description of her, you would probably say librarian. Why? Because she's what you typically think about when you think about the stereotypical, prototypical librarian. Okay? But the odds are, statistically, that she's a beautician, because there's a lot more beauticians in the United States than there are librarians. Can you think of another type of representative heuristic? Here's another example. Let's say you're in, I've used this one before. Let's say you're in Japan and you're walking down the streets of Tokyo and you see a native Japanese man who happens to weigh 600 pounds walking toward you. Take a guess as to what sport he plays. Did you say sumo wrestling? Pfft, nailed it. The next concept we'll discuss isn't so much a problem-solving strategy as it is a eureka moment. And this is called insight. Insight is a sudden realization of the solution to a problem. It is not strategy-based. The answer just comes to you out of nowhere. It's when you're sitting there trying to think of a problem and you can't think of the solution, you can't think of it, and then boom, it just pops into your brain. Like when you can't think of someone's name. You're trying to think of someone's name, or hey, remember that actor who was in that movie that one time? What was his name? Well, I can't. Man. And then 30 minutes later, boom, there it is. It might make you think of blocking, but blocking is when you can't remember. Insight is when you, boom, have that instant realization. Now, how do we know about insights? Who came up with this? Well, it's important to note that this is one of the earlier, more fascinating subjects in the history of psychology. And it comes from this guy named Wolfgang Kohler, who's pictured here. And he used an experiment with monkeys in which he would dangle fruit, like bananas and apples and other fruits, from the ceiling. And then he would put all these random boxes in a room. And then he would allow the chimpanzee in the room and just see if the chimpanzee could figure out how to get to the fruit. That's pretty much it. It's a guy who put a chimp and some boxes in a room and then hung some fruits from a ceiling to see what would happen. Pretty interesting experiment, you think? Well, it turned out to be. And the monkeys, the chimpanzees, just were standing around looking up at the fruit, looking at the boxes, and then, hey, wait, what do you know? If I stack this, we can get it. And from that experiment, Wolfgang Kohler made a career and came up with a concept called insight. How we think has a huge impact on our decision making. So, for example, when we're trying to make a decision between two alternatives, we have to judge its utility and its probability. Its utility is the value of a given outcome. So if we accomplish our objective, what is the value of that accomplishment? Is it worth the effort? Is it worth the possible risk involved? And if it is, then you need to weigh the probability. What's the likelihood that you can actually achieve it? Okay? And then we can apply some former heuristic concepts to decision making. So we can apply representativeness and availability heuristics to decision making. So for example, when we decide to pick a babysitter or decide to pick a way of travel on vacation, depending on those heuristics. Another influence on how we form judgments on a daily basis or our decision making is how a situation or how a question is framed. This is also known as how the way an issue is posed or the way a question is posed. For example, you might remember from our previous Unit 9 in memory, we discussed the 7 ways memory fails us, and one of those ways was suggestibility. Suggestibility, if you remember, we used the example of the police lineup where you're the witness to a crime and you're trying to identify the suspect, and the police officers are trying to lead you to identify a particular suspect. They're saying, hey, that's the guy who did it, right? They're trying to put a false memory in your brain. Well, they're framing that situation in such a way so to lead you down a certain road, down a certain path, to conform to what they want you to do. So that's how framing can impact a situation. It also is relevant to research methods. If you remember the wording effect, this is relevant to surveys. You need to be really careful in how you word questions on a survey so that you don't, so that your bias does not influence the data, so that you don't lead your subjects to answer in a particular way. So that's another danger of framing. These logical problems are tricky not because they are intellectually demanding, but because people tend to be overly rigid in their thinking. But there's more. Once we think we have a solution, we fall prey to what's called the confirmation bias. It's a tendency to look only for evidence that will verify our beliefs, which can prevent us from realizing that we are in error. This bias is a pervasive and has a negative influence on the way people approach the problem in their daily lives. This is oftentimes why certain economic philosophies or political philosophies that are quite outdated tend to persist and last a long time, is because of the confirmation bias. As noted, people search for evidence that verifies their beliefs. But what happens when we confront information that plainly contradicts our beliefs? Do we revise our views as logic would dictate? Not necessarily. In a series of studies, Anderson and his colleagues found that our beliefs are often highly resistant to change. For example, subjects read case studies suggesting that the best firefighters are either risk-takers or cautious types. Next, subjects were asked to come up with a theory for the suggested link. Some theories were, "He who hesitates is lost," which supports risk-taking. And other theories were, "You have to look before you leap," which supports caution. When the experiment was supposedly over, subjects were told that the information that they had received was totally false and it was manufactured for the sake of the experiment. In fact, a good firefighter just tends to put others before himself or herself. Did this discrediting evidence erase subjects' newly formed beliefs? No, it was too late. Many subjects exhibited belief perseverance. This is clinging to their initial belief even after those beliefs had been discredited. Though hardly rational, it seems that our beliefs often outlive the evidence from which they sprung. Now, there are different explanations for this. A neurological explanation would be that we've developed neurological connections for that belief, and so therefore it's hard for us to get over it or to accept a revised version. And there are other cognitive and theories as well. Using trial and error, algorithms, heuristics, and insight, people often display a remarkable capacity to solve problems. As we have seen time and again, however, our competencies are often compromised by certain blind spots. An example of that is fixation. Fixation is essentially it's Freud's explanation for belief perseverance. It's the inability to see a problem from a new perspective. It hinders problem solving. And there's two types of fixation. This is important to note. There's two types of fixation. It hinders problem solving and inability to move on to a new perspective. One type of fixation is called the mental set, and this is a tendency to use a strategy that has worked in the past. So, for example, if you have not studied throughout the course of the week, you did not utilize the spacing effect, as Mr. Stansel has encouraged you to do throughout the beginning of the year, and you've just crammed before the night before the test, and you've passed every test, well, that's going to only encourage you to continue to do that. And so if you continue that into the AP exam, you're going to be sorely mistaken, okay? Well, can you think of what kind of conditioning, what type of conditioning is involved in the development of the mental set? Answer, operant conditioning. Think about it. All right, first things first, whatever you do, do not write this down. This is an example of functional fixedness. You don't need to write it down. It's excessively wordy, so don't write it down. Okay. So now that I said that, a second type of fixation that interferes with problem solving is called functional fixedness. And this is a tendency to think of objects only in terms of their usual functions. Another thing that gets in the way of decision making and forming judgments is overconfidence. This is the tendency to be more confident than correct. Have you ever walked into a test thinking, man, I'm going to ace this thing, and then the next day you see your grade and you got a 50? What the heck happened? Well, that's when you tend to be more confident than accurate. It's a pretty simple concept to understand, right? But when you apply it to the real world, it can be kind of tricky. So imagine you're on the Who Wants to Be a Millionaire game, and you take an opinion poll from the audience, and the audience overwhelmingly votes for answer choice C. Do you say, man, it's overwhelming, I might as well pick it? Ooh, what if it's not C? What if they're all wrong? You never know. Well, that concludes 10.2. We'll see you next time for 10.1. Peace.